The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 44. The Tale of the Three Sisters. Content warning. Minor character's brutal murder described briefly. 3 weeks before term was set to recommence, Draco received what appeared to be a formal invitation by post owl at dawn. It was heavy parchment, and its green wax seal was enchanted to move, a sinister snake body slithering beneath the skull. Draco recognized it from the sky above the forest at the Quidditch World Cup years before. It reminded him painfully of the night he had feared most for Hermione's safety. Turning over the invitation to read the salutation, Draco's blood ran cold. Draco Lucius Malfoy, Head of House, Most Noble and Ancient House of Black. Temporary Head of House, Most Noble and Ancient House of Malfoy. The Scion Suite, in the East Wing. Malfoy Manor, Wiltshire. He broke the seal, watching as the small circle of wax fell away, then seemed to evaporate into a vapor, and hover as a green spectre above the parchment. The parchment only contained 8 words. Riddle House, Little Hangleton, August 13th, 11 o'clock. Draco felt as though he couldn't breathe. He read the words again as though bidden to memorize them, turned the parchment over to find nothing else, then read them a 3rd time. The things that weren't written down were what scared Draco most. August 13th was tomorrow. He had so many questions to ask, and there were no answers to be given. He entered the breakfast area to find only Middy, his mother's elf, and Tiffy, who did most of the cooking. "What can Tiffy get for Master Draco?" she asked kindly, with a tremulous smile. "Where is my mother?" he asked, a bit too loudly. "Tiffy does not know, sir, and Middy cannot say, sir. I is being given orders not to speak of it," Middy said, with sorrow in her voice. "What do you mean? Who told you not to speak of it?" Draco's voice grew louder and more harsh. "Middy's mistress, sir," Middy nearly whispered, small tears forming in her eyes. "My mother told you not to tell me where she is!" Draco nearly yelled. "No, Master Draco. Middy's new mistress is Mistress Bellatrix. Miss Sissy told Middy she is having to give Middy up to Miss Sissy's sister," Middy cried. At this she began wailing miserably and fell to the floor, wiping her tears on her pink tea-towel dress. Red filled his vision. Had Narcissa been imperious? Coerced? "Middy, Tiffy, I am the master of this house, and I demand you reveal to me where my mother has gone." His voice sounded deeper and angrier than even he had ever heard it. The elves cowered frightfully in front of him, Middy throwing up her arms to cover her head, Tiffy just bowing to the point of nearly lying prostrate on the ground. With a startle, Draco realized that he was towering over the pair in a rage, and likely looked and sounded a lot like Lucius in that moment. He took a calming breath. Kneeling down, he placed a steady, gentle hand on Middy's arm. The tiny elf flinched, but raised her head slightly. Her blue eyes were red-rimmed, cheeks puffy, and Draco realized that she'd likely been crying for some time that morning. "Middy, I'm sorry to yell at you. Can you tell me what happened? When did my mother pass you to Bellatrix?" he asked as kindly as he could. The 2 elves stood, and Draco lowered his stance, dropping back on his haunches to get at eye level with them. "Middy was summoned last night at midnight, sir. 'Twas strange, because Miss Sissy goes to bed right after dinner, since Mistress Bellatrix comes here, sir." Draco could see from her expression that the elf had thoughts about this, but was unable to verbalize them because of her loyalty ties to her new mistress. "Miss Sissy tells Middy that she may be going away for a time, and that Middy must follow Mistress Bellatrix's orders now, sir. Then she's transferring the elfin bond to Mistress Bellatrix." "And she didn't tell you where she was going?" Draco asked brokenly. "Mistress Bellatrix—" At this, the elf clapped her hands to her mouth, then dropped to her knees and began banging her head on the floor. Draco quickly picked the elf up and drew her hands away from her mouth, pinning them to her sides. He realized that if the elf continued to try to tell him, she would only fail because of the bond between elf and mistress or master, and would only keep trying to punish herself. "Stop, Middy, please," Draco asked. Then he lowered his voice again. "Can I ask you a few more things? But I order you not to punish yourself if you can't answer." Middy nodded gratefully. Apparently this did not go against any order Bellatrix had given her. "Is there anyone else in the house except for me?" Middy shook her head and said, "No, sir." That was good. At least Voldemort wasn't here. "Is the snake here?" This he nearly whispered. Middy shook her head again. No. "Did Miss Sissy seem happy when she told you about the bond transfer? Sad? Like she felt nothing at all?" Draco needed to know if she had been imperious. "Miss Sissy was crying. She was upset." Middy wiped at her own tears again. "Middy has been with Miss Sissy since she was a baby. Middy and Whimsy and Raffy were the elves for the Black Sisters. We were so proud of us girls. Whimsy and Raffy was Middy's sisters, Master Draco. We was 3 sisters for 3 sisters," Middy said tearfully, huge tears continuing to fall unbidden from her reddened eyes. This brought Draco up short. "Where are Whimsy and Raffy, Middy? What happened to them?" Draco asked softly, afraid of the answer. Once Middy had managed to compose herself a bit, she began to speak. "Raffy was given clothes when Miss Andry left," the wretched elf wailed pitifully, "and Whimsy—" Here the elf stopped, clapping her hands to her mouth again, but thankfully not beating herself senseless on the ground. Clearly she had been told at some point not to talk about what had happened to Whimsy. "When was the last time you saw Whimsy? Don't try to answer if you can't," Draco said gently, hoping to find a way around the elfin bond of silence. "The last time Middy saw Whimsy was behind the stables at the Black Farm in Belgium, sir. Middy wasn't sure if it was Whimsy because it didn't look like Whimsy any more, sir. But she had on Whimsy's blue towel, sir, so it must have been Whimsy. There was too much blood everywhere else, though, sir. Igvard found her, sir." "Igvard? Who is Igvard?" The name stirred a memory for Draco, but with everything else swirling in his mind he couldn't place it. "Igvard was very kind. He kept the creatures at Black Farm, sir. But after he found Whimsy that day, sir, he said he could not stay. He was too sad, sir." Middy cried anew at the memory of the loss of Igvard, the loss of Whimsy, the memories of that day. Suddenly an image of a tall, brown-haired man with wide shoulders and kind eyes came to Draco. He was holding the rope tied loosely around the neck of what Draco thought of as his hippogriff, Starclaw. So Igvard wasn't just an acquaintance of Narcissa's. He had worked for them, had likely known her for many years, and he had found the poor elf Whimsy, unrecognizable after whatever it was that Bellatrix had done to her. The thought made Draco want to vomit. "Middy, I'm so sorry for what happened to your sisters." Draco closed his eyes as his hand held both hands of the tiny elf. He had known Mitty all his life, and had never realized the pain she'd been through. It made him wonder briefly what kind of life Pym had lived, and he hoped he'd get the chance to ask someday, but right now there were more pressing issues. Mitty, are my mother and Bellatrix, did they go somewhere together? The elf thought for a moment, then decided that this did not break her oath. Yes, Master Draco. He exhaled deeply. Okay. Did the Dark Lord go with him? At this, fresh tears appeared in Mitty's eyes. Yes, Master Draco, she said somberly. Mitty, did my mother want to go with Bellatrix? He looked into the elf's pained blue eyes. No, Master Draco, Miss Sissy did not want to leave you alone. He asked Tiffy to take the sorrowful elf to her room to lie down, and ordered them both not to speak about their conversation with him today. He would not be the cause of another elf sister's demise because Bellatrix learned that some of her secrets had been shared inadvertently. He sat heavily on the ground, arms wrapped around his knees as the shadows of early morning faded into the soft sunlight of full day. After a long while, he wiped at his eyes and returned to his suite, leaving the table laden with untouched breakfast platters behind. Back in his room, Draco was faced once again with that sodding summons from Voldemort. He had no idea what Riddle House was. Apparently it was in a village known as Little Hangleton. Draco wondered briefly if he could get away with not going by simply saying he didn't know how to find it. He couldn't yet apparate, after all. A pop next to him startled him from his thoughts, and he was relieved to see Pym. They looked at each other for a long moment before Pym spoke. Master did not eat breakfast? I'm sorry, Pym. I wasn't hungry. Did you speak to Tiffy? She told you about what Mitty and I talked about? Yes. Pym knew Miss Sissy was gone. Mitty called Pym when they left. Could she say where they went? No, Master. Pym is sorry. Draco drew in a pained breath. It's okay, Pym. I'll find her. Draco rushed to his closet, removing his travelling cloak and heavy dragonhide boots. Pym thinks that Master Draco should stay here. They will be coming back. What? Draco had been mentally trying to think of things to bring with him that he could likely not conjure under duress. A knife, his travel potions kit, a water glass, some bandages. The ones who left will return. Their things are all here. They did not leave for a long time. So I should just wait. Pym nodded. If Master wishes to be taken to where Miss Sissy is, Pym thinks he should wait here. Of course. In his panic over his mother being gone, he'd not put it together. She was likely with them at this Riddle House, and they would be coming to bring him there. And they would keep her until whatever this was done. Draco sighed and walked to his bed, lying back and putting a pillow over his face. Pym, can you tell me about your family? Are you married? Do you have children? Master Draco knows many of Pym's family. Draco removed the pillow. Yes, I met Eustace, and Folly, too. Mitty is Pym's daughter, and Folly's aunt. Draco's breath caught. Pym, I'm sorry. I didn't know that Whimsy, your daughter... Well, I'm so sorry for your loss. Was Whimsy her mother? No, Folly is Raffi's daughter. When Raffi was freed, she went to Hogwarts for a long time. But when Raffi met Nymphadora, she went back to her family. She's with Miss Andry now. Draco was growing more confused. Pym, can you tell me a bit about my family, too? Who exactly is Andry and Nymphadora? After several hours and lunch together with Pym, Draco had a clearer picture not only of Pym's family, but his own. Andry was his Aunt Andromeda, the Aunt A of the books in his closet. She had married a Muggle-born, and her daughter Nymphadora was an Auror. Pym had been the personal elf for Alphard Black, the brother of Walburga and Cygnus. When Alphard was removed from the family tree for going against the values of the House of Black, Pym had been moved to the stables and gardens of Cygnus's manor home. He knew Igvard, who worked at the house in Belgium. Pym had married an elf called Savvy, but his wife had passed away of dragonpox soon after Midi, their youngest daughter, was born. Pym had been happy when Cygnus and Druella had 3 daughters. He considered it to be good luck, and was glad that his 3 daughters had a bright future with the Black girls as their mistresses. When Whimsy was killed soon after Raffi was freed, it sent Pym into a dark place. Narcissa had been close to finishing at Hogwarts and was betrothed to Lucius. She asked Pym to work in her house when she married, so that he might stay close to Midi. It had been Pym's greatest honor to be assigned to Narcissa's son when Draco was born. But it had hurt Pym that Narcissa's husband had chosen to follow the same beliefs as Bellatrix Black Lestrange. Pym had worried for many years that Draco would follow his father's lead. "I'm doing all that I can to not follow my father's footsteps, Pym. But I don't know what's about to happen. They've summoned me to this place. They said that I need to stand as the head of the house. They said I need to complete an impossible task for them." "Master Draco is too young to be head of house," objected Pym. "Somehow I don't think the Dark Lord cares about normal rules and traditions, Pym." Draco leaned back on the sofa in his suite, staring at the ceiling. "I think I need to go to the library and look around there." Pym looked sorrowfully at his young charge, the boy that he had cared for from infancy. Now 16, as tall and nearly as broad as his father, but with his mother's kind eyes, the boy needed every bit of support he could get. Pym held out his arm to Draco. "Pym can take Master Draco to the library," he said evenly. Draco smiled a bit wistfully, and held Pym's arm in a way that he had not in several years. Once Draco had grown taller than Pym, it was understood that he no longer needed his elf's help in getting places around the manor, much like a Muggle parent no longer needs to carry their children after a time. But this small reminder of the connection they shared, it helped calm Draco in an unexpected way. They popped into the Malfoy library, and Draco turned to address the room, which was magicked to respond to vocal requests. Text containing the name Tom Riddle. Chapter 45. Moonlight Sonata. Several hours later, now well into early evening, Draco had an idea of who Tom Riddle had been. He found Riddle's Hogwarts graduation announcement from 1945. Riddle was named head boy and Slytherin prefect, and had received a commendation for special services to the school. He seemed well on his way to a role in leadership within the wizarding world. Yet later there was a small article from 1956 about a theft at Borgin & Burke's, thought to be perpetrated by an employee, a shop clerk called Tom Riddle. Draco was surprised that someone with a head boy badge would have ended up as a shop clerk. The photo accompanying the Hogwarts article showed a handsome young dark-haired man who looked nothing like the Voldemort that Draco had met. But the grainier photo from only about 10 years later, the one about the theft at the shop in Nocturne Alley, revealed a more gaunt, haunted-looking Riddle. Draco was able to piece things together a bit. It seemed that Tom Riddle had begun styling himself into Voldemort at some point in the 1950s. He still had his ancestral home, apparently, although Draco found it odd that he was the only Riddle mentioned in any Daily Prophet articles. Apparently his parents had never done anything of note in the wizarding world. Riddle all but disappeared around 1957, when he was last spotted in Muggle London. The article simply said that Riddle was being sought for questioning by Muggle law enforcement, who were following up on the murder of a Muggle tramp named Billy Stubbs. Draco searched for articles mentioning the village of Little Hangleton, but the list was incredibly short. There were only 3 brief pieces, all concerning the same man, Morfinn Gaunt. The first, from 1927, said that Gaunt had been tried and imprisoned for 3 years in Azkaban for breaking the statute of secrecy, using magic to harm a Muggle, and resisting arrest. His father, Marvolo Gaunt, received a shorter sentence for resisting arrest and harming a witch, who apparently lived in the house with Marvolo and Morfinn. Then, an article from 1943 said that Morfinn had been arrested for killing 3 Muggles in the village. It mentioned that Morfinn lived alone in the cottage where he was arrested. There was no mention of the father or the witch. A final article from 2 years later simply stated that Morfinn Gaunt, of the village of Little Hangleton, serving a life sentence in Azkaban for murder, had died in Azkaban with no known heirs. In short, a dead end. Next, Draco searched for older articles from the First Wizarding War mentioning you-know-who, which were nearly as scarce. He was mentioned briefly as a factor in the ouster from office of Eugenia Jenkins as Minister of Magic. His increasing power in the early 70s led to her dismissal in 1975. Likewise, his name, or rather the lack thereof, appeared in relation to numerous deaths and tragedies throughout the late 1970s and the start of the 1980s. The final mention of any importance came in November 1981. This was the breakdown of the murders of James and Lily Potter, and the survival of their young son, Harry, all at the hands of Lord Voldemort. The articles concluded that Voldemort had died in the encounter, and speculation continued on and off for years about exactly what had happened in Godric's Hollow that day. Draco had a feeling that Riddle had laid low in the 1960s and early 70s, gathering his followers and building his power, perhaps trying to figure out a way to create eternal life for himself, considering Draco's discussions with Lucius years ago about the Philosopher's Stone. After a brief plummeting in his stomach, Draco did a text search for books that mentioned methods for prolonging life, or that discussed eternal life. In addition to the use of a Philosopher's Stone, there was vague mention of an obscure spell involving soul magic, and a discussion about drinking unicorn blood. Reading the bit about unicorn blood, his own blood chilled. He took out the handkerchief and spoke the password. "Did Potter ever talk to you about the unicorn? The one that the creature had been eating in the Forbidden Forest?" The reply came back quickly. "Yes, he believes it was Lord Voldemort, possessing Professor Quirrell." Good God. Draco looked back at the events in his memory, now realizing that for years Lord Voldemort had been much closer than he had realized. He had been working in Draco's first and second years at Hogwarts, trying to come back. He had had Peter Pettigrew in disguise, living within the castle walls for years. In Draco's 4th year, people had likely been helping him within Hogwarts. Igor Karkaroff, perhaps. Possibly even someone else. Draco was now certain that that was how Potter had ended up in the tournament. And somehow Voldemort had succeeded, at the end of Draco's 4th year, in coming back to life. He felt as though his head had been in the sand this entire time. He asked Hermione the first random question that popped into his head. "How did Potter end up in the Triwizard Tournament, Mai?" For the next hour or so, they exchanged messages. Questions were answered. More mysteries were unraveled. And he still had a feeling that not everything had been said. But he had a clearer picture. "Mai, he has summoned me to his ancestral home. I'm not sure why, but it's going to happen tomorrow, whatever it is. Actually, it's after midnight now, so it's going to be later today. I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm scared." "Oh my God, Draco! Is there any way for you to escape?" "No. He has my mother. I think he and Bellatrix are keeping her captive there. If I try to escape, I am sure he would kill her. My mother had set up a way for me to escape earlier this summer, but I knew you would not come with me, and I wasn't going to leave you." Her reply took so long, Draco was worried that it was not going to come. "Draco, thank you for caring about me enough to want to take me with you. But you're right, there are things on the horizon, big things, forces that we can't even imagine, and Harry is going to have to face them. He's going to need all of the help he can get." He replied back, "I understand all of that. That's why I didn't ask. But just know that you don't have to save everyone, Mai. And also know that I will do everything I can to save you." After a moment he was startled to realize that his handkerchief was slightly damp. He touched his fingertips to his own face in confusion, but his eyes were dry. The situation had become so dire that even tears were not enough right now. Then it occurred to him. These were Hermione's tears. He held the handkerchief to his mouth and kissed it softly. After a moment, he used his to dry his own eyes as well. Draco had tossed and turned most of the night. As the sky turned from black to grey, he fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of dead unicorns and the shops of Knockturn Alley. He woke at 3 in the afternoon, showered and dressed in a black dress shirt, black trousers, and black robes. When he emerged from his closet, lunch had been served in his sitting area, and he picked at the sandwiches, drinking 2 large glasses of elderflower juice. Then he called Pym for a calming draught. Hermione wrote to say that she loved him and would be thinking of him that evening, and to remind him that no one would blame him for running away, or for owling Dumbledore for help. This in particular made Draco scoff. If Dumbledore knew the mission with which he'd been tasked, he would be in Azkaban within minutes. And to leave his mother in captivity with that monster, he could not do it. At 8, Tiffy served dinner. It brought a small smile to his face to see all of his favourite dishes: chicken cordon bleu with asparagus, gnocchi with walnuts and gorgonzola, and dragon roll sushi. There were poffertjes, apple streusel, and dark chocolate gelato for dessert. No single course made sense with the next, and the vegetables were scarce. Despite the menu, Draco struggled to eat more than a few bites of anything. At 9, he gave dinner up as a bad job and went to the conservatory. He sat at the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys, then striking the opening notes of... he couldn't remember the name of the sonata, but the notes were familiar. Once he had reached 13 and had reached proficiency, his mother allowed his lessons to lapse, but he remembered each note, each rest. When he finished, Pym touched his elbow lightly. "Moonlight Sonata, Miss Sissy's favourite." He hopped up onto the bench and sat down, short legs sticking straight out, small shoes tucked under the keys. He opened the lid of the piano with a snap of his fingers and floated the sheet music out to Draco's outstretched hands. On the back were written in careful writing: "Music takes notes and makes it beautiful. It takes discordance and makes it exist in harmony. It takes differences and brings them together." Andromeda Black, 1966. He looked at his watch. Less than 2 hours until... He considered throwing up. He considered throwing himself off the roof. He considered trying to disapparate, even though he didn't know how. and finally he summoned a quill, ink, and parchment. Dipping the quill in ink, he began to write. Dear Aunt Andromeda, I don't know you, but you sent some books to me when I was a baby, so I guess you know of me. My mother once told me that your crime, the crime that got you banished from our family, was loving a Muggle-born. It is a crime that I have committed as well. Instead of banishment, I am taking the coward's way out. I do not think I can beat them, so instead I will join them. I will protect her from the inside, or I will die trying. But in case I fail, I must ask a favor of you and your husband. My mother tried to get me to leave and join the mundane world only a few months ago. She had a plan, documents, and money. I believe you and your husband were helping her that day. But I could not leave my witch behind. I am adding your name to my accounts at Gringotts. I do this in the hopes that, if the time comes that Muggle-borns are being rounded up and killed, you will do what you can to help her escape. I know she may not accept your help, just as she's already refused mine. But if they come for her, perhaps there will still be time to get her away from here. And please, tell Hermione that I love her. Toujours pure, Draco Malfoy. He pinned a second letter to Gringotts, adding his aunt to his accounts, and called Thorn to the conservatory, sending them off into the night. It was well after 10 now. His nerves were standing on end. He was beginning to regret the sushi and gelato. It suddenly occurred to him that he didn't know how he was getting to this Riddle House. In all the worry of what would happen after he arrived, he'd never considered the journey. At 10:55 he walked into the parlor where the main flue was located. As he stood, looking at the grate, uncertain, there was a pop behind him. Turning, he spotted, well, he was uncertain what it was. It looked like sheer fabric, some sort of vellum, perhaps, though closer inspection revealed that it was segmented, and looked hard to the touch. With horror, Draco realized it was a bit of snake skin, shed from a very large snake. Nagini. 10:58. He knew what he needed to do, but did not wish to do it. Pym entered the room, and Draco was reminded of all those years before when Pym came to collect him for his first lessons in becoming a gentleman. His eyes prickled with tears, just like then, but he forced them back. They locked eyes across the room. Pym nodded once. Draco attempted a smile, failed, then nodded back. He reached out a hand and touched the snakeskin. The hook sensation behind his navel pulled him into darkness, into a feeling of compression, into a separate dimension, into a future unwanted. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great 78.